At the end of the 15th century, Spain had almost completed the Reconquista and the removal of the Caliphate from the Iberian Peninsula, ending centuries of Islamic rule. One of the first things they did was usher in an attempt to unify and purify the country as a Catholic one rather than as a multi-religious one. After receiving permission from the Pope, the Spanish monarchy persecuted hundreds of thousands of people for the crime of not being Catholic. Learn more about the Spanish Inquisition, why it occurred, and common misconceptions surrounding it on this episode of Everything Everywhere Daily. This episode is sponsored by Fiji Water. You've probably heard of Fiji Water and have seen it in stores. Well, Fiji Water really is from the islands of Fiji. Drop by drop, Fiji water is filtered through volcanic rock, 1,600 miles away from the nearest continent and all its pollution, protected and preserved naturally from external elements. In this process, it collects a unique profile of electrolytes and minerals, resulting in more than double the electrolytes as the other top two premium bottled water brands, giving Fiji water its smooth taste. Fiji water's electrolytes are 100% natural, and this water even has a perfectly balanced pH of 7.7. I've recently been trying to reduce my consumption of diet soda, and I found Fiji water to be a great alternative. Visit your local retailer to pick up some Fiji water today for your next backyard party, beach day, hike, or even your home office. Fiji water is Earth's finest water. This episode is sponsored by Mint Mobile. According to recent data, approximately 98% of all Americans own a mobile phone. And that means a monthly phone bill is something that almost all of us share. With all the bills you have to pay, why pay more than you have to for your phone bill? With Mint Mobile, you can start with plans as low as $15 per month. And with Mint Mobile, you can keep your phone, your number, and use the same towers and networks that you do now. All you do is save money. And that's why I recommend Mint Mobile. This year, skip breaking a sweat and breaking the bank. Get this new customer offer and your 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month at mintmobile.com/EED. That's mintmobile.com/EED. Upfront payment of $45 required, equivalent to $15 a month. Limited time new customer offer for first 3 months only. Speeds may slow above 35 gigabits on unlimited plan. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. The Spanish Inquisition was an event that took place over a much longer period of time than most people realize, and was the response to another extremely long period in Spanish history. The Spanish Inquisition was a 350-year campaign aimed at ensuring religious conformity in Spain. An inquisition is technically just an official inquiry or investigation into a specific matter, but as we'll see, the Spanish Inquisition went far beyond this, involving harsh interrogations and brutal punishments. Historically, the Catholic Church used inquisitions to investigate and punish heresy. During the Spanish Inquisition, 150,000 people were accused and prosecuted for this crime. To understand the Spanish Inquisition, it's first necessary to understand the state of Spain in and leading up to the 15th century. During the 13th century, Spain consisted of multiple kingdoms. The two primary kingdoms for the purpose of this episode were the Christian kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. Aragon and Castile led a series of conquests across Spain to reclaim territory that had been lost to Muslims centuries earlier. The event was known as the Reconquista, which I covered in a previous episode. After the Muslims were mostly ousted from Spain, the country was united under a composite monarchy. This means that each respective kingdom would have its own laws, customs, and culture, but be united underneath a single monarch. During the Reconquista, incidents of violence broke out, including the murder of thousands of Jews in the year 1391. Following multiple anti-Jewish riots, half of all Spanish Jews converted to Catholicism, becoming what became known as conversos. Despite converting, conversos were still in plenty of danger. They were often distrusted by Catholics who felt that they still practiced Judaism in secret and were frequently attacked by violent mobs. Likewise, after the conquest of Granada in 1492, Spain also ruled a sizable Muslim population, many of whom were later baptized as Christians. They were known as Moriscos, who were likewise suspected of crypto-Islam. The Spanish Inquisition began near the end of the Reconquista. At this time, King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella ruled over Spain jointly. Both monarchs were devout Catholics who felt that Jews and Muslims threatened Spain. To address their fear, the two monarchs wrote to Pope Sixtus IV to grant them the right to establish an inquisition. The request was granted, and the Spanish Inquisition began. The first step in the creation of an inquisition was the creation of a tribunal to carry it out. As such, Ferdinand and Isabella established the Tribunal of the Holy Office of the Inquisition. The tribunal structure had multiple layers, with the Council of Supreme and General Inquisition, or the Suprema, as the top layer in the country. The Suprema was the only formal institution that was made by the monarchs. There were typically 6 members of the Suprema, with the Inquisitor General presiding over the body. The Inquisitor General was nominated by the Crown and then appointed by the Pope. Their duty was to oversee the policies and activities of the Suprema. The Suprema mainly oversaw the local tribunals, who would be in charge of investigating and judging cases within their jurisdiction. Local tribunals consisted of a Grand Inquisitor, constables, attorneys, and scribes. The Grand Inquisitor was the highest-ranking official and would oversee the operations of the tribunal. Below them were the Inquisitors. Their main job was to identify suspects and investigate, which would be completed through testimony, surveillance, and formal accusations. From there, inquisitors would preside over trials. In these trials, they would act similarly to a jury. They would examine the provided evidence, question the suspect, and ultimately give a verdict. The main goal for inquisitors was to ensure the religious conformity of those who converted to Catholicism. From there, the next layer would be the arresting constable. The constables acted as enforcers, carrying out the orders of the inquisitors. They mainly executed arrest warrants and delivered suspected individuals into custody. Once delivered into custody, one of the inquisitors would take over the role of a prosecuting attorney. This attorney was the investigator of the case and was tasked with uncovering if the suspect was guilty of heresy and deciding whether or not to prosecute them. The final layer of the local tribunals would be the scribes. The scribes would attend torture sessions and record names given by suspected heretics. The layers of each tribunal made up an effective machine to help identify potential heretics and maintain the Catholic control of Spain. The first Grand Inquisitor, and perhaps the most famous, was Tomás de Torquemada, who was appointed in 1492. Many of the procedures for the Inquisition can be traced back to Torquemada, as he was the one who wrote the Inquisitor's Code. The code outlined the punishments for heresy and how the Inquisition would take place. It also classified heresy as treason and therefore punishable by death. One of the major tenets of the Inquisitor's Code was the Edict of Grace, or a grace period, where those who confessed to heresy, denounced their religion, or turned in any family members, friends, or acquaintances would be spared. However, after the edict ended, it became fair game for the inquisitors to persecute anyone suspected or accused of heresy. Several things were looked for to suspect if someone was a practicing Jew. One of these was whether a chimney was smoking or not on a Saturday. No smoke was a sign that Jews were honoring the Sabbath. Another sign was buying vegetables instead of meat before Passover. Additionally, many people were accused of heresy by anonymous accusations. These accusations were typically very vague, and those accused were presumed to be guilty, but they were often just people exercising personal grudges. Those arrested usually had no idea who accused them and could be imprisoned for months or even years at a time. While in prison, their property would be confiscated, which would often result in their families being homeless. Those arrested also had the potential to face torture. The primary forms of torture were water torture, torture on the rack, and suspending people by their wrists, tying weights to their feet, and dropping them multiple times. Contrary to popular belief, victims were not put in comfy chairs. Those who decided to confess would need to do so publicly at events known as auto de fe, or acts of faith. During these events, the accused would be marched into public squares where a mass would be held. After mass, confessions would be made, and the sentences of the accused would be read to the public. Afterward, the guilty would be handed over to the authorities for their sentences. Common punishments included penance, public flogging, prison sentences, and working as galley slaves. Other forms of punishment included exile or wearing a marked garment that declared them a sinner. The worst punishments would be being burned alive at the stake, though this punishment was much more uncommon and reserved for those who refused to renounce their religion. To avoid being burned alive, many of the accused would just confess to minor forms of heresy, like hanging their laundry on the streets on a Saturday. The first group targeted by the Spanish Inquisition were, of course, the Jews. Torquemada used the monarchy to issue a decree against Spanish Jews. The decree would give the Jews just 4 months to convert to Christianity or leave the kingdom. Anyone who stayed behind risked being punished. This resulted in roughly 40 to 100,000 Jews being expelled from the kingdom. As mentioned before, those who did convert, the conversos, were far from safe, despite the majority of them being willing to assimilate and adopt Catholicism. After the persecution of the Jews, the Inquisition then shifted its focus to the Moriscos, who converted from Islam. The first legislation passed against the Moriscos was in 1502, which stated that Muslims needed to convert to Christianity or be expelled from Spain. This was actually less effective than the edicts against the Jews, and the results depended on which kingdom in Spain was carrying out the orders. Kingdoms in the interior and the north had been integrated for centuries, which led to the edict essentially being ignored. As the Inquisition carried on, the conditions did become worse for Muslims. More edicts followed and Morisco trials did occur, but the majority of cases resulted in lighter punishments than their Jewish counterparts. There were also Christian heretics, although these cases were few and far between. Those accused of Protestantism or Lutheranism had longer trials and typically ended with prison sentences. And there just weren't that many Protestants in Spain. There were also some witch hunts, though this was much less of a concern in Spain than in other European countries. The Spanish viewed witchcraft as a superstition, and the Inquisition felt that there was often no real basis to the accusations, so never pursued them. While the Spanish Inquisition is considered brutal by today's standards, and it was, many of the practices carried out within Spain can be regarded as being relatively modern for the time. For example, accusations would need to go through a panel of experts, which could be comparable to a jury today. And traditionally, in the past, that was never done. The defendant was also allowed to submit the names of people who held grudges against them to make the evidence unreliable. Additionally, the defendant would have the legal right to representation, which was unique compared to countries like England or France. Obviously, there were tactics used during the Spanish Inquisition that are far from modern, mainly torture. Torture was standard for most courts at the time, but what made the Spanish case unique was that torture was only used in 2% of the cases. Also, as far as torture goes, torture in Spain was often less cruel than in other countries. According to the rules, torture could only last for 15 minutes at a time and was never to be applied more than twice. Additionally, if there was a concern of mental illness or furiosis in the accused, torture was typically not carried out. This is because those suffering from mental illness were considered unable to disbelieve what they were taught knowingly and therefore could not be a heretic. Another common myth of the Spanish Inquisition was the number of executions. When you compare the number of deaths from the Spanish Inquisition to other tribunals, the number is actually pretty small. Over a 350-year period, the Spanish Inquisition had an estimated death toll of only 1 to 5,000 people. And most of those deaths came in the first few decades. During the same amount of time, the rest of Europe was experiencing witch hunts which saw an estimated 60,000 people executed. The reason why the Spanish Inquisition has developed such an exaggerated reputation is that much of the reporting was from Protestant countries in Northern Europe who used what was happening in Spain for anti-Catholic propaganda. Some of the propaganda reports on the Inquisition put the death toll into the millions, which would simply have been impossible at that time. When the Enlightenment reached Spain in the 18th century, the Inquisition began to slow down as its ideas were challenged. Despite attempts at censorship, Enlightenment ideas still entered Spain through foreign texts and word of mouth, and the ideas began to spread amongst the nobility and government. The Inquisition technically lasted until 1834, but it had been abolished a few times before that. The first time was when Napoleon invaded France and took over Spain from 1808 to 1812. The Inquisition was reinstated after Ferdinand VII recovered the throne, but was re-abolished in 1817. This abolition lasted for 3 years. Though the Inquisition was never formally re-established, it was still de facto practiced. During this period of de facto Inquisition, a schoolteacher named Cayetano Ripoll was the last person executed in 1826. This execution actually sparked a controversy across Europe as an example of tyranny in Spain, and just 6 years later, the Inquisition was formally and finally abolished. While the actual severity of the Inquisition has been exaggerated throughout history, the impact the Inquisition had on Spain can't be understated. For over 350 years, Spanish society suffered from extreme paranoia, social unrest, and fear. Free thought in both religious and scientific contexts was completely stifled. The climate of suspicion and fear of persecution, along with the expulsion of tens of thousands of Spain's most skilled individuals, stifled economic growth and limited entrepreneurial activity, ultimately playing a major role in the nation's economic decline during this era. Because of this, the Spanish Inquisition wasn't only a period of religious persecution and fear, but something that affected every aspect of life in Spain. The executive producer of Everything Everywhere Daily is Charles Daniel. The associate producers are Austin Oetken and Cameron Kieffer. Research and writing for this episode was provided by Olivia Ash. My big thanks go to everyone who supports the show over on Patreon. Your support helps make this podcast possible. And I also want to remind everyone about the community groups on Facebook and Discord. This is where everything happens that's outside of the show. As always, if you leave a review on any major podcast app or in the above community groups, you too can have it read on the show.